Thank you all so much for coming. Really appreciate you taking some time out on a Friday night to come and join this conversation, this community conversation. Really appreciate it. My name is Nick, and I'm part of the Transition Town Brixton, which is part of the Greater Transition Town movement, which is all around the world, and of course in the UK. So the schedule for tonight, after a short intro by myself, we're going to have a quick, is it a prayer or a dance?
An invocation.
An invocation from the Emanuela. And then I'll introduce our first speaker. We have two very special speakers for you this evening, Ella Jones and Rob Hopkins, and that's part of the Brixton project here and also runs the Community Research Exchange. Rob is co-founder of the Transition Town movement and part of Totness, most Totness and transitions everywhere. Anyway, so yeah. So, very quick intro. We find ourselves at a sort of yet another crucial moment in time in history, where we're faced with multiple crises, from the climate and ecological emergency to inequality growing within and between countries, conflicts. There's the genocide happening right now, being live streamed, pretty much every day. Growing polarization within and between communities within this country, and of course within and between countries as well. Taken together, it becomes quite clear that humanity faces something of an identity crisis. And that identity crisis calls us to ask ourselves certain very basic questions. What does humanity mean? Who are we to each other? How do we want to live together? Those are some just basic questions that we should be wrestling with. Given the backdrop of the multiple crises I've just briefly sketched, what are we to do? We sign petitions, we write letters to our politicians, week after week, month after month, year after year, we hit the streets and protests, and still nothing seems to change. And in fact, every 5 years, we join this ritual, this circus called elections, electing politicians, and guess what? Nothing seems to change. So if, as it has been said many times before, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but we're expecting different results each time, then clearly we are kind of mad. But ours is not the usual kind of madness. No, we're not madness as defined as being constrained by irrationality. No, ours is a sublime kind of madness, a sublime madness. And that sublime madness is driven by courage. It's rooted in hope. And it's also driven by our imaginations, our collective imaginations. But hope is on a tightrope at the moment. Ducking and diving, trying to outmaneuver the forces of despair that seem to stalk us every day. And that is what sort of drove us to start this series of community conversations called Spaces of Hope. There are many alternatives. And Spaces of Hope are spaces of love, not hate. Spaces of unity, not division. Spaces of cooperation, not competition. Community, not individuality. Collective action, not individual desperation. And above all, spaces of untamed collective imaginations. So our aim in putting this series of community conversations together, Spaces of Hope, there are many alternatives, is to demonstrate that despite being constantly told by our politicians, governments and big businesses that there is no alternative, there are in fact many alternatives to business as usual. So we scheduled these series of events. They're 4 to 6 weeks apart, and we'll be dealing with various issues that we face, various things that might cause us to despair. We'll be looking, for example, at our next events. It's about housing and community spaces. We'll be looking at cooperative communities and mutual aid, youth affairs and community education, and of course food and health. And the series will culminate in December with what we might call a community action plan and a people's assembly, where we try to get the working groups or the people that are sort of that gravitate towards each other after each session, to work towards things that the alternatives presented in the sessions that we can perhaps implement in our communities. So the ultimate aim is not to build a utopia per se. What we want to try and create is an us-topia, a we-topia of sorts, something rooted in community. Let's call it Brixtopia here, because we are here. So, as I said, we have two fantastic speakers, and before the speakers come on, before I introduce Ella, who will speak first, and then dear brother Roger will speak afterwards, I want to invite Manuela to open up the space, as it were, please. Thank you, Manuela.
In these spaces of hope and many alternatives, I would like us to imagine, and in this space of imagination, any obstacles or barriers that may stop us from fully embedding them somehow. And in this removal of obstacles, actually imagine the paths opening and the doors opening. So I would do a Kathak style, which is North Indian dance, a classical North Indian dance, invocating a deity called Ganesha, who has the head of an elephant and the body of a child. And he's the one who removes obstacles and open passes. So if you want to take that opportunity to imagine that for yourselves or for everyone or for this session right now, thank you. Gan, hati, katra, muka, mangala, kita, tung, tata, ei, jay, jagavan, dana, traka, tuna, tahadita, da, vikahara, shukahara, tagina, tahadikita, imikita, turanga, tadikina, te, turanga, tadikina, te, Turanga,
Thank you so much, Manuela. Thank you. Right, so we have our first speaker, Ella Jones, and Ella is part of the Brixton project and also holding the community research exchange, which is being driven by the Brixton project. Ella will be talking to us, drawing on her experiences from research she did in Cuba, and we thought Cuba is very interesting case studies for what countries or people might do when they're faced with sanctions. Cuba has been under trade embargo since 1962, and despite sort of all these sanctions that are being placed upon it, the country has thrived in many different sectors. For example, food growing, urban agriculture, education, and health. Now, that is not to say Cuba is a perfect country, of course, by no means. But what we are trying to show within this series of events is that when we are told there's no alternative, you dig within community, you dig within yourselves to find alternatives to the status quo. So please give a warm welcome to Ella Jones.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Manuela. And you guys will have to bear with me because I got paper. I don't do this on a day-to-day. I'm an artist. I'm usually in the studio, so give me grace and I'm looking at this paper. Yeah, I'm here to talk about spaces of hope, or we are here to talk about spaces of hope. And before we jump onto Rob's time machine into the future, I'm going to spend a minute with you lot on the ground, doing what one does before travel, gathering belongings, notes, maps, a compass for travel. Taking a moment to mourn the place we're about to leave, recalling the parting words of encouragement, reassurance, and taking one last glance out at what was before a new world is revealed. For many of you here, departing will be a relief. Abandoned, dead terrain, stagnant cities that hold no promise, no progress. Looking back is often not the fashionable thing to do. I'll be digging around in the archaeology of our thinking, unearthing terms, thoughts, promises that might make you wince, feel shame, sadness, anger. As the first person in the series of talks, as Nick said, that end decisively in action, my talk will unearth past resources of hope, tools that might help us better locate ourselves when we do arrive. And the title of my talk is Art, Brixton, Cuba, ABC. I try to keep it simple because that is one of the things, these three things are not. And Nick, I thank you for actually giving an overview of Cuba, which is not easy to explain, and I'm not going to attempt to. In reality, I will talk about art, Brixton, art again, and then Cuba, but that spells out ACAB, and I'm not sure that would have been but Kylie was in charge of that, so I probably would have done. When I talk about art, I'll be talking about Cubism, because that's what I do as an artist. When I talk about Brixton, I'll be talking about us, because that's where we are. And when I talk about Cuba, I'll be talking, as Nick said, about my experience there, living and working as an artist, kind of between 2020 and 2023 on a residency. All three are underpinned by contradictions, which problematize the act of returning, which haunt us and force our neck the other way. But there is energy left in the old myths that bind these three things. They are not yet spent. I'm therefore not going to be offering answers or solutions, but presenting you with their fragments to make your own sense of, or build something new with. I'm an artist. I was born and raised in South East London, Lewisham, which has a lot of history of Brixton. I grew up haunted by the memory of Stephen Lawrence, the New Cross fire. I walk past that house every day on my way to uni at Goldsmiths, where I study fine art. Resistance soon filled these gutted spaces. The Black People's Day of Action, the Battle of Lewisham, the Brixton uprisings. And from time to time, the energy seeps into our present, but I can often feel hopeless here. The spirit of what brought us together feels lost, walking down Brixton Station Road. The weight of our past, a burden in the face of the present. But I hope at the end of my talk, we can call forth this melancholy of what should be, because these very well-trodden streets remain a space of hope, gifted from our forebears who took to them, and they are watching what we do next. It's these experiences growing up in South East London that inform my artistic practice, as a white girl growing up in a working class area, Afro-Caribbean community, of what Paul Gilroy would call conviviality, or like the normalcy of this, the day-to-day, juxtaposed with the ever-increasing tendency towards nationalism and fascism, a yearning to recover whatever Englishness is when it's perceivably under attack, whether that be by the docking of the HMT Windrush in 48 or by small boats across the channel in 24. And I use Cubism to explore the sometimes boiling but always simmering contradictions between race and class that permeate South London. Cubism was that new way of seeing, described as a philosophical equivalent to the revolutionary thinking occurring under modernism at the turn of the 20th century. Casting off the robes of the past, modernism was said to find itself a style in Cubism, reflecting the new epoch's optimism and self-confidence, its hope, and faith in the reality of concrete experience. This shattering of the world of things preempted a new world view, an art not of imitation but conception, not of sight but insight. It accounted for changes in viewpoint, different perspectives, strange juxtapositions, depicting contradictory forces between objects and the transformation these objects imposed on one another. Cubism was therefore an art of construction, and therefore I believe and reconstruction, tools which can be used outwardly to depict the contradictions that persist in social life, to make sense of them, like I have here in the triptych of the New Cross fire. Well done, Charlie. But also inwardly to interrogate and critique the origins of its own form. In 2020, I visited Cuba to trace Cubism's origins back to West Africa and through to the Caribbean diaspora, where Wilfredo Lam synthesized the Cubist form with the experience of his own Afro-Cuban identity, whilst maintaining a critique of its colonial root. Lam rejected Cubism's analytical exploration of form, which removed the meanings, discourses, and functions from its original source in West African sculpture. Lam wasn't interested in the African mask as a morphological teaching to make sense of European worlds, but as an inventive exploit for shaping the supernatural, its mytho-poetical and expressive teaching. The mask didn't just embody or represent the sacred, it personifies it and communicates it. It was a synthesis between Cubism and Surrealism where Lam found he was able to blur the line between the real and the unconscious, encouraging him to articulate what he described as the spirit of his culture. And he didn't have far to find Surrealism. His godmother practiced Santeria, the Afro-Cuban religion incorporating Catholicism with Yoruba cultural practices. Within this, Lam discovered what was in Cubism a horizon of desires or a laboratory experiment was in Cuba the latent everyday. Trevor, I'm realizing you're filming me. I don't know if you're filming.
Too late. Where am I?
The intercultural dialogue between Cubism and Lam's Afro-Cuban identity is presented in his painting La Honga, or the Jungle. Lam depicts 4 orishas, spirits depicted as hybrid creatures, part animal, part human, with mask-like faces and elongating limbs dissolving into stalks of the sugar cane, which penetrates the foreground and background of the painting. Here we find surprising juxtapositions, alluding to Lam's Afro-Cuban hybrid identity and its relationship with Cubism. For example, the title, The Jungle, with its content, sugarcane, a field-growing crop, initially introduced by the Spanish, referencing Cuba's colonial history. The interchangeability between the figures and the jungle perhaps presents the post-colonial Cuban identity as inescapable from and rooted in its African history, although now free, still subject to the same inequalities. Another surprising juxtaposition is that of the abstracted African mask-like faces, with the figurative images of scissors in the top right-hand corner. This contradiction could symbolize the break from the Eurocentric legacy of Cubism and the return to the meanings it vacated in its exploration of West African art. In Lam's words, his painting was indeed an act of decolonization, and the scissors the anti-colonial cut necessary for us to sever ourselves from the cultural colonization. Lam returned Cubism's appropriation of primitive formal structures with the meaning it vacated, using it to turn its perspective within itself, not disregarding its language, but rather appropriating, recycling, adapting it. Lam uses the far left figure in the painting to unveil this new, decentralized world to the audience, poised as if he came to some revelation. He is astonished by the discovery of his whole universe. The Jungle, in its deliberate execution of contradictory forces, juxtaposition of content and language, and explicit acknowledgement that the Cubist form was entrenched in a colonial impulse, presents a potential strategy, a means of understanding and thereby resisting. It becomes a representation of revolt from the depths of the unconscious, with Lam describing himself as the Trojan horse that would spew forth hallucinating figures with the power to surprise, disturb the dreams of the exploiters. Lam's ability to reappropriate and reconstruct the Cubist language to represent new landscapes inspired me when I returned to Cuba in 2022 following the pandemic. It allowed me to start to make sense of the contradictions that I encountered daily on the streets of Havana, which I tried to make sense of in a series of prints that were made in an independent print workshop in Havana, and a painting which is in progress. And I can't believe I'm showing a painting in progress. The image is based around an interaction I met with a man in a park, actually, who was teaching a kind of a group of young people how to play football, and he asked jokingly if I wanted to join, and I was like, no, I'm wearing flip-flops. But anyway, some days later, I bumped into him at like this well-known kind of tourist hotel called the Hotel Presidente, where he was wielding a machete and tending to the gardens, clearing weeds for tourists. We said hello, and he began talking, and he told me that he was a doctor. proceeding fervently to take out his identification card to make sure I knew he was telling the truth. He said he didn't earn enough money as a doctor, so he works as a gardener or a machetero on the side. The image resonated with me then, a doctor of 50 or 60 years in a cap, open shirt and vest, boots and a machete, clearing weeds in a tourist hotel to survive, hopeless. It resonated with me even more with the arrival of COVID-19, where we saw Cuban medics discharged across the world to help crumbling medical systems in the West, hopeful. With lamb's fields of sugar lingering on my mind, I found an old sugar sack imported from Brazil, but being used to hold cement. Both sugar and cement scarce materials in Cuba today, and I reversed it, painting the image of the doctor El Medico on top. During the pandemic, Cuba sent over 8,000 doctors to Brazil. The sack represents this contradiction, and it will degrade over time, the oil paint eating away its weave. In Cuba, I met artists whose installations remain on paper, diagrams, architectural drawings waiting to be realized when the materials come available. You use what you can find, recycle, and make again. The painting didn't need the reference, but in the print, it spells out carne. Contemporary Cuban artists often preoccupied with the idea of the identification card. El carne de identidad, or el carne. When I first heard about it spoken about conceptually in conferences, lectures, and university classrooms in Havana, my English ears confused it with la carne, or meat. But this crude connection made sense in the context, because they were talking about censorship and the policing of bodies, and the disconnect between the self and the construction of identity on paper by another. It made me think of the machetero, or the doctor. In the image, the man wields a machete, a symbol of Cuba, of resistance, revolution. Here they were a symbol of survival in a different way, something to be explained and excused. The rooster, also in those old constructed visions of Cuba, hanging on National Gallery walls, a symbol of El Campo, virility, strength, machismo, laying headless on street corners, maintaining connections with those past, the past. Rachel Price describes contemporary Cuban artists as keen to comb through facets of the past, half centuries still under wraps, searching for new narratives. Enzo Traverso, in his book Left Wing Melancholia, touches upon what combing through the facets of the past decade or so might look like. His words echo what Cuba has lost, and the context behind the contradictions I describe in this image of the doctor might explain. Traverso explains that the political foreclosure post-May 68, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the disintegration of state socialism, which instead of liberating new revolutionary energies, seem to exhaust the historical trajectory of socialism. Traverso describes as a stuck in a present, suspended in time between an unmasterable past and a denied future. And I think that's a perfect description of where Cuba is right now.
Can you say that again?
Suspended in a present, stuck in a present, suspended in time between an unmasterable past and a denied future. Struggles for liberation are forgotten. They become ghosts which haunt our recollections of supposedly finished and archived experiences. Spectres look for people who generated them through their bad conscience. Stalin, and for some Cubans that would be Castro, who now haunt and disfigure the memory of socialism, making any desire for a new utopia feel potentially totalitarianist. And that's what I kind of meant when I began this talk by saying it's unfashionable to look back. Traverso evokes Freud's definition of melancholy as an incomplete or unaccomplished mourning, denying separation from what was lost and therefore from transforming it. Socialism is simultaneously a finished experience and an irreplaceable loss, denying separation from the lost, beloved ideal and impeding transference onto a new one. A successful mourning, moving on so to speak, could however mean acceptance of our identification with the current system, with capitalism. Melancholy, therefore, in its memory and awareness of the potentialities of the past, becomes a form of resistance, a space of hope. Dragging these ghosts into the present, I want to bring us back to Brixton. Today we seek out spaces of hope in an old Lambeth Council office block. This artery now severed from its modernist forebearer next door, the architecture of which developed out of Cubism, a revolutionary way of seeing, with a promise to enrich local life. The Brixton project was one of the first community groups to occupy this hourglass, sand nearly done, when it closed its doors to public service. Melancholic, but not mournful, because there is still blood to be drawn from these giant grey walls. The architect Bertold Lubetkin said of his brutalist blocks in London, "These buildings cry out for a world that has never come into being," with Owen Happily clarifying that these buildings are not so much ruined as dormant, ready to be recharged and reactivated. Half-ruined buildings once again take on the look of buildings waiting to be finished. For those of us growing up in and around the city, the cells of the city, stacked estates and towering blocks, one doesn't need to question the relevance of Cubism today. Its shapes so deeply embedded in the modernist ruins surround us. These little cubes, pregnant with revolutionary potential, and stillborn into hands unable to revive. Instruments lost. How do we revive them? Do we want to? And is there a we? Looking back offers spectral blueprints to relocate ourselves and begin drawing up new plans, returning to the grids of Cubism, which were always stabs at description, full of crossings out and redundancies, adding new meanings, subjects, reflective of our new material realities. But we have the blueprints. Our task is to decipher what lies beneath, retrace the faded indentation clinging onto white paper, rewrite it, no longer afraid of looking back. So before we head on our travels, my question to you all would be, what are the fragments we are bringing together? Which ones are we discarding? Which are the ones that need dusting off and a new place found, perhaps configuring, returning on their heads? Which ones are our prized possessions, the ones we ensure are kept safely in our baggage for departure?
Very much. Right, we're going to have a few minutes for questions or discussions. Any, Charlie? Me? Yeah. So, any questions for?
Yeah, I need to find that there's a roving mic somewhere. Oh, there it is. So it just needs turning on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. Ella, that was amazing.
Thank you, Charlie.
It's like being in a. I mean, no, I'm not taking the piss here. Like, I know. It's like being in a poetry recital. That was absolutely amazing. So thank you. That's so good. So we've got. It's a very bright light from the projector. But are there any questions or like in the room? It'd be good to like sort of bring the room into these discussions as quickly as possible. So if anybody's got anything, any comments, any
Did it change your mind about hopeful, hopeless? Because there was a moment where you looked at it as hopeless. What was that? What was your education around that? About perception and reality, and now how does that feed into your view of the world? This world?
Of this world. I think I went to Cuba with probably the same kind of misconception of the reality of the country that many people share, especially on the left, when you're kind of looking for spaces of hope. And when I got there, it's contradictory. I think, honestly, it's really contradictory. I think there were moments where I thought, wow, there is a lot of, it's still there, it still exists. When you go into, I went to Goldsmiths, and I felt like an alien. I grew up in New Cross, and I felt like an alien going into that university. I think it's so white, middle class, the art kind of scene in the UK, and over there I went into conferences, art galleries, lectures. There were people in their work overalls coming from work. It was completely diverse, and that to me felt like, oh, that's amazing. But I know that's not the truth. There still exists racism, there still exists inequality, but on a kind of surface level, I thought, wow. And there are other examples of that kind of permeated my trip there, but I think what struck me was also just how hard it is to live. I think I found like an egg on my last day, and I've been there for months, and it was like this amazing thing. So I think the reality for people out there and why a lot of the young people are leaving the island is because there's nothing there being generated to keep that or change it. There needs to be an alternative there in the same way there needs to be an alternative here. But I think we still have to kind of return to it, to look back. I think it's important to look back because there are things there that we can kind of bring with us forward. It's just no point abandoning it.
I've never heard of melancholy as a potential act of resistance. I've got to really think about that.
Thank you.
Okay, so at the back, and then we'll be there, and then gentleman there. So, maybe you can use a Jeff first, yeah.
I really like the last sentence that you ended with. I wrote it down. I'll try and put it down. Because what are the fragments? What are the fragments? And I feel like saying to you, therefore, the end of it would be, do you still have hope? You must have to be here in the first place. But why I liked it was because you said that to draw together, what do you discard? Because it's almost like it's the evolution of the human race that you're watching, and we're part of, and you went to Cuba with those dreams of essentialism and liberalism, I imagine, and being in Goldsmith and being a totally, somebody from Lewisham, and now you're with all the nice middle class people. But that conflict, if you like, the difference between what happens with the different kinds of people, but actually it's one human race, we're all the same, and we've all got good and bad, and sometimes we get moody, or sometimes we have hope and joy and things like that. And therefore, each individual, for me, the answer to this all is every single individual needs to keep their mind focused on the good bits, because there are so many bad bits. But therefore, how do we make a pattern for the future, and can you see a prospect of a pattern for the future that would actually take all the fragments, including the indigenous backgrounds and all the stuff that was trodden on and wiped out, can we pull it all together and make a plan that fits and includes everybody with all the different diverse views and thoughts and processes and everything like that? Have you got hope?
Thank you. Yeah, I do have hope, and I think going back to the kind of hope that I was saying Cubism harnessed was that it brought together fragments. It brought together fragments that not always agreed, that rubbed up against each other, that were conflicting, that were tense, but it made a whole out of them, and it presented to the world a whole. And I think that to pick that back up is a place to start. I think that we are fragmented politically, and there needs to be a way that we bring that together, that also recognises that there's difference within the movement, but something needs to come forth. And I'm hoping that these series of talks that last a whole year will gather these fragments along the way, and we can put something together.
Early on in the transition movement, there was an amazing film called The Power of Community, How Cuba Survived Peak Oil, and it was based around when the Soviet Union collapsed. Basically, the main artery of supply for Cuba disappeared, and they had no oil, they had no supplies, no chemistry, no chemicals. And they discovered permaculture and basically greened the city. So the car parks turned into farms, and rooftops and markets sprang up, and self-reliance and interconnectedness really came out of nowhere, came out of the isolation that they were stuck in. I wondered if there was any survival of that still, any of that kind of happy self-reliance coming out of diversity that inspired us so much.
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer. Where I was, and I'm not an expert on Cuba, I can just speak from my experience. Where I was, to get anything was just a hustle every day, and a very strange supply chain asking people that asked people that asked people that then came up with something that probably wasn't what you asked for in the first place, but will do. But I've heard about that, and I think that's interesting, but I think it comes back, not to look back again, but the estates in this country were built to like also build, to nourish their communities, and I think that there's a lot that we can learn from that. And that's just one project that I always have in mind that I speak thinking about, that estates need to be like feeding their people. There's the land for it. There's the land in Cuba for it. But the place is in such a, it's surviving out there kind of by itself amidst the blockade and whatnot. So it's kind of impossible, but I think that's something we could do quite easily if we kind of got together and done it. But I think that's a topic for a whole talk. Yeah. Not by me, an expert.
You should show the film again and then.
Yeah, do it. We should do it.
Yeah, I think it's a topic that I'm blown away by how many people are here tonight. Thank you everyone for coming, it's absolutely amazing. But like it's a topic for all of us to not just like kind of listen to your amazing experience and then listen to Rob and then go away and pat ourselves on the back and go to a dinner party tomorrow and go, went to this really interesting thing, and then all of a sudden you're back on the hamster wheel because it's Monday morning. What can we do about that? How can we start talking about these things? Because we're going to need to sooner than any of us are prepared to kind of admit to ourselves. Right, one more question. I don't know how we're doing for time, Nick. We all right?
Yes, we're fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, okay, so one more question maybe, and then we'll get drink and go to the others.
Fascinated by your experience of Cuba. I happened to stumble upon being in Havana on May the 1st a long time ago and followed everyone who seemed to be walking. It was a huge parade. I had no idea what was going on. But it was the May Day parade in Havana. And I followed it along and it ended up in the Place de la Revolution in Havana. And there was Castro in front of all the audience on the podium and all the rest of it. And when the parade had finished, everyone kind of seemed to be going along because it was the done thing and you had to, and that was it. Everyone had gone, Castro remained, and what was very interesting was seeing the people who hung around afterwards, apart from me, just out of curiosity. It was the older generation who were waving at him and chanting his name and everything else. The younger generation had gone. So it was the older generation who remembered what life was like pre the revolution. And what came across to me was how do generations pass on their experience and the issues, because that island is full of contradictions. It's a fascinating place. But we've got this issue of, with climate change, with all the other things that are going on. How does one generation say to the next generation, watch out for this, or this is what it's like? Because that younger generation in Cuba, they knew nothing else. That's all the life that they've known, for better or worse. So I'm just kind of intrigued how we can kind of pass on the experience, or lack of experience, of doing the wrong thing between generations.
That's a really good point, and I think hits the nail on the head about one of the issues that Cuba faces is that they have this massive younger generation of people that didn't remember pre the revolution and have kind of dislocated from that memory of liberation struggle that has haunted Cuba for the last 500 years. But what they do know is still legitimate because they have not got opportunities. They're growing up in a world that is sort of dislocated, but also and separated in terms of information, sharing, expression. And I actually don't know the answer to that, but I think when I spoke to young people there, they thought it was shit, actually. I was in a nightclub once, very drunk, and this girl was just like, why are you here? This island is shit. And I was like, no, but the revolution, liberation, struggle, it's amazing. Where we come from is shit as well. But at least you have this legacy that you can be proud of. I can't be proud of anything that's come before me. So I think it's strange, but I don't know, as a kind of somewhat young person, I think my experience as like looking back at our elders' kind of legacy and acknowledging it, and as I said, looking back to kind of take the bits that are worth taking, but also being like, we don't need that, this is for us now to kind of shape. That's kind of what we need to go forward with. That was a really bad answer, but I really think your question was like really insightful into what the actual state of Cuba is.
Can I give the answer?
Yes,
It's telling stories.
Yeah.
It's telling
Yes.
stories. And the old people, me, we can remember, like John says, those memories, you remember those things. And the old people in Cuba remember it all. So they have the stories to tell. And the indigenous folks are part of that. And the young people that are as lost, and lost is the only word, for the ones over there as well as the ones over here. I mean, my heart breaks for all the young people I keep talking to nowadays. I was with my grandson yesterday, and he doesn't think it's doom and despair, but the negativity, the emptiness, the way he hasn't grown up. He's still a child, he's 18, he should be a grown-up now. He's been running well twice by then. Teaching children, he's like, not that exactly. No, the experiences of old people and telling stories, and in the old days, that's what people would have done. When there wasn't all lights and electricity and telephones and everything, you travelled about, you stayed up at the full moon, you stayed up all night, went by horse and saw people in other cities and stuff like that. So yeah, the old people tell stories, young people will learn.
Storyteller booking. Yeah, there's one more question. Oh, right, okay.
Hi. So as somebody who grew up in a communist, post-communist country, this is a really relevant conversation in terms of changing the narrative of how we talk about the new socialism, so to say, because I've tried that in the context with all of that incredible knowledge I acquired in the Western world. I went back home and I told them about degrowth, and I told them all of the stories about how we're supposed to live really, and they told me, but we know it. And why do I need to change? I couldn't afford a pair of jeans until I was 25 years old. I didn't fly it until I was 50. So why do I have to change? And how do we change that narrative to kind of present something that in our culture, and especially I guess the US has such a strong power in demonizing socialism and demonizing that for so long. So how do we change that narrative to present something, the Western development, the Western way of being, capitalism, that has been shown as something so desirable to the people that thought that this was the most desirable thing to want? And I wonder what you've touched upon it a little bit in your previous answer, but I wonder, how do you go back to those people who are not from the West, who don't want to follow the West anymore? How do you talk to them?
Yeah, I think that was kind of what my interaction in the nightclub was expressing. It was kind of like your ideals of the West coming over here, but we just want to have food to eat and clothes that we can go out and pick and choose and have autonomy about what we do in our lives. I don't have the answer to that because that would be giving the answer to the next revolution. But I think going back to melancholy, because I think where all these sentiments come from is a place of despair, things not working, feeling disillusioned, with our elders feeling like they've got answers, we need to kind of, we need to share stories, and with young people feeling like, I don't want your stories. I think we need to remain in those feelings and not accept it, but we need to do something, we need to present an alternative. I do not have the answers to that, but maybe in this series of talks we can think about what that alternative means, not just here in London or South London, but when that goes afield, because revolution has to encompass everyone in different ways and accommodate to people in different ways. And I think with the example of cubism, that is bringing together different perspectives and different ways of thinking and constructing a whole out of it. And I think that's our task, to construct the whole. Again, I just keep saying that, but it is just, that's what we have to do. We have to take all of this shit and those feelings and put them into something that is a whole again, because we're just fragmented otherwise, and there's no hope in that.
One last question from Alison.
You are really wringing me dry. Alice, okay, cool. You be nice to me.
No, it's amazing talk. Thank you so much, Jen. And so obviously we chatted to you already about your trip to Cuba, and we had this same question of like, why isn't there enough food? Surely there's land to support the population there. So this is purely based on 10 minutes of Googling, right? But it looks like they're using a lot of the land to grow tobacco for exports. And I think it's just important to have some of that granular information when we are making judgments about a place, because that kind of detail gives us clues around like this kind of thing, like what are we trying to avoid and what are we trying to achieve kind of thing. So that might not be the case, but that's what it looks like from Google, like whatever you can get on Google. And so I think that brings up issues about centralisation and distributism, because obviously the people are potentially have not got the power to decide how land is used, and also about an import economy. So I think maybe running such an amazing health service as Cuba is running, that means importing lots of stuff from the West, which means they need an export to be able to do that. And so I think, again, we've got to think about this granular detail. How do we become insufficient for medical equipment that we need? Like, we totally have the expertise, we totally have the machinery within our communities, but if we don't have those things, we're still vulnerable to this kind of predatory system that the rest of the world is part of. So I just wanted to share that, but thank you so much, Ed.
Thanks, Alice.
That's an amazing segue, actually. It's almost as if we discussed it before, which we haven't. The next Spaces of Hope, there are many alternative sessions that's happening on the 7th of June. It's all about space, all about land. So I think what's inevitable is that one thing's going to roll into another. So thanks